Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to speak about the sesquiquadrate and share an example of how this particular aspect is manifesting right now. So first, the sesquiquadrate, it's an aspect that isn't very commonly spoken about or used, at least in the mainstream. It's generally considered to be a minor aspect. And the sesquiquadrate is the 8th harmonic, which is basically a square divided by 2. It's in the same family of the semi-square. So to translate this, the semi-square is basically a conjunction plus or minus 45 degrees. So basically 45 degrees between 2 points in a chart is a semi-square. The sesquiquadrate is basically an opposition plus or minus 45 degrees. So that would mean an elongation of 135 degrees or 225 degrees between two planets. Now, as you can tell, 135 and 225 aren't the most common numbers. They're not easy to mark on a chart. You can see trines, sextiles, squares, oppositions, conjunctions very easily. The semi-square and the sesquiquadrate, they're divisions of 45. Like they're half of a square, pretty much. So seeing it visually isn't very common, thus we often tend to sort of just skip it entirely. I want to speak about what it actually means, and the semi-squares and the sesquiquadrates actually are very similar. They're different. I'm going to focus right now on the sesquiquadrate, which again, a sesquiquadrate is either 45 degrees before the opposition or 45 degrees after the opposition. A sesquiquadrate is essentially where at a particular station within a cycle, this is in transit or natally, when we reach the 135 degree aspect, there is the need to slow down, to consolidate, to actually begin to organize and refine our activity. It calls upon greater self-consciousness. Now, it's half a square, and what I mean by half a square is the sesquiquadrate is basically the midpoint between the 90 degree square and the 180 degree opposition. So if you think of oppositions and squares as very yang, angular energies, it's about overcoming blocks, overcoming obstacles, kind of rounding what is hard and tense and moving through challenging stages, making new choices, kind of resolving conflicts or dualities. The sesquiquadrates in the middle of all of that are basically saying, okay, we're in the midst of all this yang external energy. Now it's time to really bring it within, turn it more inward, and cultivate more conscious refinement, more conscious attunement. That's the essence of the sesquiquadrate. It's like kind of the energy that is right there in the middle between the squares and the oppositions. Or the semi-squares too, it's right there between the conjunctions and the squares. Between these really strong cardinal angular energies, the midpoint, are these sesquiquadrate energies. And thus, embracing the sesquiquadrate energies will oftentimes bring a sense of needing to face what feels like a lot of momentum or energy, and a tendency to stay in motion, a tendency to maybe jump into a lot of busyness and doing, but we can make a lot of mistakes in that. We can get very confused. We can exhaust ourselves. We can embarrass ourselves. So if the squares are sort of blocks that are needing to be softened, the sesquiquadrates are actually in some way the opposite. It's excessive energy that needs to be curved and sort of grounded. So in some way we can say the sesquiquadrate and the semi-square resonates with the energy of learning how to apply limitations, learning how to apply appropriate use of boundaries. And maybe a better way to frame it is learning how to become internal and more self-contained in our way of being. So it's a more of a retreat from external activity and internalization process so that there's more clarity, more functionality, more ease. Now, as always, one of the best ways to learn about these aspects or anything is to look at the transits. What's happening right now? So as I was walking and I was thinking about talking about the sesquiquadrate, I took a look at the chart and I found that right now, Mercury retrograde is moving into an exact sesquiquadrate with the North Node in Gemini. The North Node at 21 degrees Gemini. The sesquiquadrate, if you add 135 degrees, would be 6 degrees Scorpio. Now, what's that mean? First, we're looking at the relationship between Scorpio and Gemini. And that relationship is a natural inconjunct, meaning they're naturally 150 degrees away from each other. And I've spoken about this before in a past video, but this is 15 degrees before the inconjunct. The inconjunct is 150 degrees. So this is sort of prior to that inconjunct energy. Here, the way this works is we have the Gemini information, perspectives, options, right? Dualities. And the Mercury in Scorpio, of course, wants to narrow it in, get to the core, get to the bottom line. But the challenge can be with all kinds of impressions. How do I choose between all these options? And we have to actually get to the core. What's my intention? What's my purpose for looking? What am I actually doing here? Otherwise, if we don't know what our purpose is, our minds can get very scattered and lost, and we can find ourselves grasping. And so the sesquiquadrate says here, first and foremost, it is time to limit your options. And this limiting your options isn't an arbitrary, just choose something and make it work. It's slow down, actually drop into the core. Sesquiquadrate, right? Entering into this new phase, this midpoint between the square and the opposition. What are you needing to internalize now? What are you working on? The sesquiquadrate, and this is another layer of information, it begins the gibbous phase at 135 degrees, which is very Virgo-like. And a part of what that refers to is it's a time of self-refinement, working on something, developing. So your information, the data, the communications, the arrangements, the plans that you're making right now, they're actually all relevant to something a little more long-term. Now, what's interesting about this is happening during a Mercury retrograde cycle. So Mercury, when it goes direct in November, will actually form the sesquiquadrate to the North Node once more. So this is the second of 3 hits between Mercury and the North Node in the sesquiquadrate aspect. So this sesquiquadrate is asking us to narrow ground, focus, sort of tune in, begin to make the adjustments, but it's also saying, and there's a larger process going on here and you can't get it all done at once. So the invitation I feel in this transit, and we'll feel this exact over the next day or so, as Mercury comes into an exact sesquiquadrate with the North Node. Good morning. Is to do what we can. See where the options and the excessiveness in terms of information or activity can be narrowed, and things like chanting, things that will come and direct the mind to a bottom line, be super helpful because it'll allow us to see through the perception of options right now. And then it's like we have control over what we have control over, and we don't have control over what we don't have control over. So the parts that we can't see, the connections that are yet to be made, we just have to allow that. But I feel right now, happening in the context of this Mercury retrograde period, in particular, being in the first part of the retrograde, meaning this is before the Sun and Mercury join, so we're still in the first half of this Mercury retro cycle. So to me, it's very much, there's a lot to develop and work on, a lot of plans, a lot of things to put together right now, actually. And we can find ourselves filled with very meaningful and useful activity, and it'll continue. It'll continue to clarify and refine itself, but I feel this is a really meaningful couple of days to give ourselves the permission and the ease to feel that we can drop in a little more deeply,